So let's get the summit started. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to our very first speaker. Bhushan Sethi is a partner at PwC US and a globally recognized thought leader whose insights have shaped conversations from the boardrooms to the World Economic Forum and the G20. He's a sought-after advisor and award-winning speaker and an adjunct professor at NYU Stern School of Business, where he helps shape the leaders of tomorrow. Today, he will bring his perspective on inclusive growth and the future of work, a topic that we all believe is more vital than ever. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Bhushan Sethi.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Absolutely delighted to be here in Copenhagen, a great city. I actually lived in Malmö in the last century, 1999. I remember the bridge being constructed, and it's wonderful to be back. So let's talk about inclusive growth. How do we measure growth? At a country level, we measure it through gross domestic product, GDP, the total amount of products and services an economy produces. That's aggregated based on economic profit that companies produce, companies that we work in, that we will work in, companies that we procure from. But this growth, and I've tracked GDP from 1980 to the current day with a few countries that have interest. I'm of Indian origin. I was raised in the UK. I now live in the US, in New York. I've tracked GDP there across a few different countries. The Saudi delegates will note that I've tracked this for Saudi. And if we look at the last kind of number of years from 1980, we see that growth is not predictable at a GDP level. We had something called the COVID epidemic just a few years ago, and we see the dip there. We had a financial crisis. Maybe some of you don't remember that. Maybe you were in high school. But we had that, and kind of economies went down, a number of economies. You know, our Saudi colleagues will tell you that in the early 80s, GDP was negative in Saudi, and now it's on a massive growth trajectory, kind of given the oil prices back then. So this growth was never guaranteed. We always have volatility at a country level. We always have volatility in profits and earnings at a company level. Yet today, and given some of the points that Tina mentioned, it's actually much, much harder. Why? Obviously, geopolitics are impacting where work gets done, where production is made, where supply chains are set up. We have uncertainty around trade and tariffs, and it's really hard from an investor perspective or a company perspective to really understand where do you actually make capital investments, how do you actually drive that return on manufacturing, how do you actually get that human capital. We have a trust gap. Whether we like it or not, people aren't trusting the media. People aren't trusting governments. Businesses are actually the most trusted resources across different demographics. There's an opportunity for the business community to build on that trust, to not erode that trust, and actually drive inclusive growth. So as we think about inclusive growth, what does it actually mean? We have GDP growth. We have record profitability in some of the areas, if you look at the tech earnings or the bank earnings just this last quarter. But inclusive growth means everybody participates. It means we do not have rising income inequality like we have in my country, in the US, like we have in Latin America. When I go back to my country of origin, India, I'm so impressed by the infrastructure, the digital wiredness, the entrepreneurial skills, the tech titans, yet income and wealth inequality in India is also dividing. So inclusive growth means we provide economic opportunities, job security, access to education, and the dignity of work to as many people as we can in a society. That's really what we need to be striving for as business people and as policymakers. So if we talk about trust, what's really scary is in the Edelman Trust Survey this year, Edelman has been doing this for 25 years. They surveyed 33,000 people across many different countries and many different education types and type of work. One of the scariest stats out there was 40% of people now are believing that hostile activism of whatever cause they agree with is justified. It could be because of a social issue. It could be because of a geopolitical issue. But they believe, 2 in 5 people in our population believe that it's okay to manage disinformation, damage public property, take the law into their own hands, intentionally spread disinformation. This is really dangerous and a microcosm of society. We saw it 2 days ago in Colorado. We sadly saw it in December with the murder of an executive in New York where I live. Like, we have a fracturing of society, and we have rising activism and people willing to take the law into their own hand and feeling very justified. So where does this come back into inclusive growth? Potentially, if we create economic opportunities, if we create access to education, if we can manage the polarization in our communities and our workplaces, we might just have a chance of driving an inclusive growth agenda. So how do we do that? What does it take to actually drive growth? And I'm going to think about this now at a company level. When I work with businesses around the world and different sectors, there's a few things that we think about in terms of giving all of their stakeholders the opportunity to participate in that economic growth. The first is access to education and skills. Making sure that whether it's a female in sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's someone in a call center whose job is going to be automated, they have the dignity and the opportunity to have education and have reskilling. And whether that's learning business skills, whether it's learning human skills, whether it's learning tech and AI, or all of the above, that's critical in our societies right now. And businesses have to and are taking a lead on that topic. It needs to continue. We need to responsibly deploy technology. We need to be making sure that technology is designed with inclusion in mind, that we're getting the right developers of diverse perspectives at the table, that we're thinking about the ethical violations that can happen. We need to make sure that the machine learning doesn't give a credit decision to a person based on discriminatory factors. Again, this is not new news, but we have to think about all of this together in terms of product and service design, in terms of skills, in terms of innovation and thinking creatively on how we use technology, because AI is here to stay, as Tina mentioned. Yes, there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of struggles right now about capturing that value, but it's not going away, and we have to use it in a responsible, inclusive way. We cannot let the digital divide that we have seen of the last 10 to 15 years, where the haves and the have-nots have increased based on access to digital technology or the education around digital skills. We cannot let that digital divide become tomorrow's AI divide. Again, we'll have more fracturing of society. We'll have more activism. We'll have more distrust. What we also need is healthy competition. The banks need the fintechs. Healthcare needs entrepreneurial startups. The education traditional sector needs edtech. We need healthy competition at a company level, at an industry level, and a country level. That's how we drive inclusive growth. What we also need is capital flows. Just like China is investing heavily in Latin America, natural resources. I visited Bolivia 2 years ago, and the salt flats there, and they have a lot of natural resources around lithium. There are investments and capital flows now going into places like Paraguay that wants to be a digital center. One of my clients is setting up in Bogota as a place to access talent. I share with you those examples because as someone who's a proud Indian, it's not all about moving work to India and accessing that. Inclusive growth means thinking about talent pools around the world as a business, and what you need to do to work with policymakers and educators to kind of rise up that population and give access to education. And it involves inclusion and collaboration. We can learn from different sectors. The healthcare sector has to work with the tech sector as we think about administering telemedicine, but as we think about new drug discovery, using AI in a responsible way. So what connects all of this in an organization? The ability to lead in an inclusive way. And there are some examples of firms that are doing this. One of the payments firms in the US has 20,000 employees. They made a decision during the pandemic to move everyone remote. Now, 6,000 of their call center workers are still working remote out of choice. They haven't forced those people back to the offices. They pay them above minimum wages, and they're actually in the top 5 companies on great places to work. These are real stories. There are other stories around institutions investing in upskilling of AI to all of their people. Now, not everyone is using AI in their organization, but this one firm has decided to upskill everybody because it's the right thing to do, because it improves their employability in the future and prepares the organization. So as we think about what does this mean to a leader, we're all leaders in this room. We can lead from anywhere. What we need now is courageous leadership. Completely agree with what Tina was describing around those traits, and I would add to them. I would say that right now, leaders need to be advocating to drive inclusive growth, advocating for the consumers that are unrepresented in product design decisions, advocating for those voices that are not in the room, for those marginalized communities who you'll be impacting as you make investments, as you think about deploying technology. Leaders need to be out there and challenging the status quo. Now, I know this is difficult. It's difficult for me as a father and as a lecturer, as an employee, as a partner, but we have to challenge. If you see bad behavior in your organizations, if you see a lack of inclusive leadership, if you see downright discrimination, we have to be the ones that call this out in our communities and our companies. Leaders have to take risk. We're not going to drive inclusive growth. We're not going to be able to give access to marginalized communities to education, to employment, without taking a risk. And again, there's some good practices. We work with firms that are actually hiring people who are ex-cons coming out of the prison system. We're working with firms that take a skills-based hiring perspective, which basically says, do you have the skills and potential for job roles, as opposed to strict university qualifications and experiences. So there are pockets of goodness and good practices out there that we should gain confidence from. But being able to sense and respond to change, being able to challenge, being able to take risk, being able to convene others to say, how do we collectively drive inclusive growth for an industry, for our organization, for our country? How do we bring in people that are disenfranchised? How do we bring in the polarized? Critical right now. And as I think about this in terms of lessons learned, a lot of what I'm saying is not new. A lot of what I'm saying sounds very straightforward. But we've learned just recently, coming out of the pandemic, that there's a lot of challenges. Whether it's a loneliness epidemic that's right now happening with young people in many parts of the developed world, whether it's immigration restrictions which impact the ability for talent to stay in a country, or for students to think, can I actually be employed in that country? There are challenges. We all know that businesses have a short-term focus because it's all about quarterly earnings if you're a public company. So we know there are challenges. The legal and regulatory environment around DEI, a moving target around the world. The regulatory environment around AI is clear in Europe, less clear in the US. So we need to, as leaders, think about some of these constraints as well. So there's opportunity, but we need to be thinking about some of these constraints. We've talked about good jobs and good quality jobs. Some of them are not so good because we have toxic environments or we have workload issues, etc. And I'm in the country that actually recognizes well-being and happiness in a region of the world that actually gets award after award around that topic. So as I think about RAP and I think about a call to action for all of us, wherever we lead from, the first thing I would say is, as we drive inclusive growth, the first thing we got to do is reimagine stakeholder capitalism. So what do I mean in plain English? There's been a pendulum swing now where originally we were focused on all stakeholders. We cared about investors, we cared about regulators, we cared about employees, we cared about our suppliers, we cared about our customers. That has shifted into more shareholder because the markets, we're beholden to the markets, and that's really the ultimate measure of market capitalization. We as leaders need to shift that back. We need to be thinking to drive inclusive growth, what's right for our consumers? How do we actually give someone the economic security of investing in their first house if we're a bank that can actually provide credit? How do we design products that are right for our consumers and not drive obesity in the future and a huge impact on healthcare system if we're a consumer products company? So really thinking about how do we deliver on all stakeholders and then start to measure that stuff. Be accountable and transparent to say, we're going to measure economic profitability as a company, but we're also going to factor in well-being. We're also going to factor in externalities around consumer harm or what we're doing to the environment. Now, this takes disclosures and this takes regulation, but the more that we can be thinking about that as leaders to say, how do we have sustainable profits so we can have inclusive growth as a company and as a country? That's where we need to go. The other thing we need to be doing is building skills, like we talked about, in terms of creative skills, critical thinking, obviously tech skills and business skills and human skills. But we need to be building good citizens for tomorrow, whether we're in the education sector or whether we're parents or whether we're business leaders. Being a good global citizen means you actually care about trade flows. You actually care about a rising tide can lift all boats. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not a country-first mentality. It's a world-first. And finally, we have to address workplace polarization because workplaces are just a microcosm of society. We all have polarization. We all worship differently. We love differently. We see the world through different lenses around social issues and geopolitical issues. We all do. We all have our biases. But that doesn't mean we can't coexist in a company, in a community, in a country, and bring our best of ourselves to the workplace and actually say, how do we innovate and design new products? How do we use AI in the right way? How do we create economic security and good jobs for all? So as you think about each of these, as you go through kind of the next few hours at the conference, as a business person, as a policymaker, as an educator, as a member of civil society, I encourage you to bear this in mind in terms of really thinking about what's each of our role in driving inclusive growth for our country, for our company, and our community. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that forward-thinking